Welcome to a conversation on race in the colonial past and present. I'm Sally Yurkovich, Director of Educational Exchange and Special Projects at the American Scandinavian Foundation. Scandinavia House and the American Scandinavian Foundation are pleased to be able to present this virtual program today. It is one in a series of programs on the complicated issues involving race and identity in the Nordic countries and the US. The next Race, Identity, and Belonging program will take place next week, January 21st at 1 p.m. Please look at scandinaviahouse.org for more details. In the meantime, you can also view We Carry It With Us, Fragments of a Shared Colonial Past, a documentary by Helle Stenum. This film investigates collective memory and the different perspectives on Danish colonialism in Denmark and in the US Virgin Islands. It also features our two artists who are with us today. Jeanette Ehlers is a video, photo, and performance artist based in Copenhagen, Denmark. She has created artworks that delve into ethnicity and identity that are inspired by her own Danish and Caribbean background. Her pieces revolve around big questions and difficult issues, such as Denmark's role as a slave nation, and issues that often get overlooked in Danish historiography. Vaughn Belle is a multidisciplinary artist from the Virgin Islands. Her work responds to questions surrounding the coloniality of the Virgin Islands, both in its present relationship to the US and its past one to Denmark. It borrows from elements of architecture, literature, history, archaeology, and social protest to create narratives that challenge the colonial process. And together, Jeanette and Vaughn created I Am Queen Mary, a statue that depicts Mary Thomas, an important West Indian labor leader, and we'll hear much more about their collaborative work today. Ursula Lindquist is an associate professor and chair of the Scandinavian Studies at Gustavus Adolphus College. Ursula is going to be our moderator today. She teaches courses on Nordic film, literature, cultural studies, folklore, post-colonial studies, peace studies, and gender, women, and sexuality studies. She is an ASF fellow and with our support did research in Denmark and Sweden. She's also been a Fulbright fellow to Sweden. So welcome everyone, and I'll turn it over now to Ursula.
Great, thanks so much, Sally, and thank you to Sally and Kyle and everyone at ASF for setting up this exciting Zoom webinar. It's such a privilege to be here as a part of this conversation with Jeanette Ehlers and Vaughn Belle to talk about some fantastic historic work that they've been doing. To get us started, I understand they've prepared a presentation describing I Am Queen Mary and the process. So I'm going to just turn things over to them and let them talk about their work, and then we can have a discussion about it afterward. Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you. And thanks for inviting us.
So, yeah, thank you. So I'll let Jeanette, you'll start with the presentation and
okay.
and sharing the screen.
Yeah, sure. Yeah.
Right. So we could probably say that there have been many beginnings to this project, but we'll start with 2014 when Jeanette and I were actually approached by Helle Stenum, whose film is being screened also by your foundation. And she approached us in thinking about doing some kind of commemoration for the upcoming 2017 centennial anniversary of the transfer of the Virgin Islands from Denmark to the United States. And she in the beginning, there was this idea of thinking about a warehouse to warehouse project, a series of exhibitions and some kind of exchange between the two countries. And she approached Jeanette and myself to think about a monument that dealt somehow with mobility and how both Jeanette and I could maybe do a monument in our respective locations. This project, however, fell apart due to loss of an institution funding, loss of leadership, and also lack of funding. However, Jeanette and I we kind of continued on, and we both had our separate ideas.
Yeah. These are the two warehouses that she was thinking about using for this exhibition. And the one on the left-hand side is the warehouse in Copenhagen called West Indian Warehouse, which is now hosting the Royal Cast Collection, like more than 2,000 copies of plaster copies of sculptures from the Western canon, from the ancient Greek times up to the Renaissance. And on the right-hand side is the warehouse in St. Croix. I don't know if it has a name other than warehouse. Do you know that, Lavon?
Oh, you dropped out for a minute, but it's actually called the Danish West India Guinea. I think it's the Guinea Warehouse or something like that.
Oh, okay. So those were the two locations that we were. And for my part, I had been working with the West Indian Warehouse in Copenhagen before, because I created a version of my live performance, Whip It Good, inside the warehouse. And in this performance, as you can see here, it's in a live situation. I whip a white canvas with a whip that is smudged into charcoal, and I created a video version of that inside the warehouse. So I was already kind of connected with the warehouse at that point. And I also, in relation to that, I also created this photo, which is a reference to Huey P. Newton, one of the founders of the Black Panther Party, as you see on the left-hand side. And yeah, so I created that inside. So my initial idea when Helle Stenum asked if I could make something, I thought to myself, why don't I take this image of resistance, of a woman resistance figure, and put it outside? And I just want to tell you why, because there's when you see here the warehouse, you see the replica of Michelangelo's David that is standing outside on his own. And I thought, it needs some company, or it needs a counterpart. And that is how I thought of putting this image of a black female resistance character outside. And then along the way, the legacy of Queen Mary was added to this character, of course, because of the bridging character of the project to begin with. So that was my initial approach to this.
And here in the Virgin Islands, being in the place that has so many remnants of the colonial period, both primarily, physically, of course, in a very different way, I think, from Denmark. Here's an example on the left of quite a rare wall, but that in the sense that it has this beautiful juxtaposition of both the coral stones that enslaved Africans would have been sent out into the ocean to collect, and then also the Danish brick, which form most of the colonial era buildings as well. And so my piece was inspired with thinking about the legacy of the built heritage, in particular, the coral stones, because usually those are the foundations of most of the buildings, and they're usually covered up by the Danish brick that's on top. And so you only really see them when those buildings are in ruin. And at my studio here, which is a part of the downtown historic district of Kristiansand, I had seen them and kind of thought a little bit about how these stones really carried the hand of these people, their labor, and how it spoke to the true foundation of the wealth of these societies.
Oh. And then along in the process. Because Helle Stenum, she, as Lavon mentioned earlier, she wasn't able to go on with the project. So so she decided to cancel it. But Lavon and I, we carried on, and then at some point we decided to collaborate and to join our projects. And not only did we join forces like with our artistic practices, we actually also combined our bodies. So what I'm going to show you now is how we did that. So this is body scanning that we both went through. This is Lavon in the chair right now. She's sitting there being body scanned. And I went through the same process. So here you see the raw material of the two of us before we were joined and created into a hybrid. And this is one of the images when the designer, he created, or he juxtaposed our bodies. So it's actually like very literal bridging project, a fusion of our bodies and of our nations and narratives.
Yes, and so here is, Queen Mary is, she's probably the closest thing we have in the Virgin Islands to a national heroine. We sing songs about her as a child. There are many, many, many artists who have done various depictions of her, mostly in painting. This is an example of a very famous one that depicts the fire burn. It's located in the post office currently at Frederiksted, the other town in St. Croix. Next slide.
Oh, sorry.
Well, I don't know, it's a little, can we go to the next slide? I don't know if you can hear me. Okay.
Yeah.
And so in thinking also about the significance of who Queen Mary was and the fact that Jeanette and I were using our bodies to kind of situate ourselves in almost in a way like a reenactment and situating ourselves inside this history, it was very important for us to make that a problematic of the work. So the title then became very important. It's I Am Queen Mary is of course referencing many different resistance movements where the Annunciation of Presence is an act of resistance. Here's an example of the famous 1968 sanitation workers strike. Next slide. And also, of course, Black Lives Matter movement also has a connection in the sense that the narrative of the fire burn has been known to be represented mostly by women, as of course the three women who started the Black Lives Matter movement. Next slide.
Yeah, we don't have the image of the three founders.
Do you think that will play? Maybe we could just play a little bit of it, the first few seconds. On the day of the inauguration, this is an example of a.
Do you hear the
no, I don't think the sound will come up.
Okay, so just a second.
Yeah, it's a little bit of example of the Black Lives Matter protest or march, not really a protest. It was the Black Lives Matter march where they joined us the day of the inauguration. So they went on the other side of the canal where the women from the fire burn were held and imprisoned, and they marched across the canal up until where we were to kind of time it.
Do you hear the sound now?
Yeah.
Og den blev budt velkommen af en demonstration.
Ja, tak.
I am Queen Mary! I am Queen Mary! She stood for equality. She stood for injustice. So I am her.
Thank you. And actually the use of the media was a very important, both a political and artistic tool for us, because we knew that as this was a temporary project, as it was an artist-driven project, a project that was not commissioned, that we knew that in order to try to make it a permanent monument, that we had to extend the conversation beyond just the Virgin Islands and Denmark. And so we actually hired a PR firm to help us do that. And it was a very successful campaign with reach of over 100 media outlets in the time that it was done, which was about 6 weeks. and a reach of over 1 billion people.
Yeah.
I'm sorry, go ahead, Jeanette. Maybe you want to talk about this.
Oh yeah. But we were really surprised about this attention. I mean, we knew that we had a great story, but we were really surprised about the attention it got, and from all over the world. So that was really, that was a great moment to us. Also to show that this is not only, like Lavon just said, something that is related to our two nations, but it's actually a global issue. We knew that, but you know, it was great that somebody caught it out there. And on the left-hand side, you see the final version of the sculpture. It's 7 meters tall. I don't know, 2-story is the measurement in US measurements. And then we were in 2019, I think it was, we were invited to take part in a show in the Ford Foundation in New York. And they wanted to have a smaller version of I Am Queen Mary, and which is the one you see on the right-hand side. And that was created for the exhibition Radical Love. And after the show, it was installed in the Barnard College, which is in New York. I guess you all know that, but maybe you want to talk more about that, Lavon, because
it's interesting how the second version obviously is distinct mostly because of the size. It's a much more human scale. It's only about 8 feet tall, and then obviously also the coral stones are different. They're a little closer to the original idea of the piece that I had done. And that also was because of the site specificity. We weren't necessarily bound to having to be a counterpoint to David. So it's interesting how the monument has transformed depending on the location. And I think we'll probably just end with some footage, the drone footage that we have, to just get a sense of the scale in the city.
So this is from Copenhagen on a sunny day. So make sure if you come to Copenhagen and see it when it's back up, that you come before 12, because then it's the sunlight is on.
Yeah. I think for those who may not know, on December 27th, the sculpture was damaged pretty much irreparably. So it's been removed until we can get the permanent version up.
Yeah.
And it was damaged in a storm, not due to vandalism.
Yeah.
Which
but it was pretty dramatic. The head and the chair, the back of the chair, was really damaged. Okay.
Okay. So I believe we can now open up for questions and conversation.
Terrific. Thank you so much. I'm going to start with a very simple question to both of you. What did it feel like to look upon the finished statue and know that your bodies were part of it? What kind of experience was that for you as artists?
It was a very moving moment, I think. First of all, it's been a lot of work, and it was just kind of unbelievable from idea and then to see this happening and to see this materialized. And that was a very big moment when when the figure and of course and the base, they came one day ahead of each other, I think. But then when the figure was put on top of the base and we were just looking at it with the crane and everything, it was really, really, it was wonderful. It was like, also because we hadn't seen it together before. I mean, we had seen a small prototype version, but of course we'd never seen the big version put together. So it was a really, really moving moment.
I think I agree with Jeanette. It was some tears were definitely shed that day. It was very moving. I think for me, as I had flown into Denmark a few days before the inauguration, I remember when I was going through customs, they asked me like, what are you doing in Denmark? And I said, we're going to make history. I mean, I remember just feeling
Literally.
like this was going to have impact. You could kind of sense it in the air a little bit. And that definitely that day we felt it too. And I think for me, it was because I had been to Denmark first in 2008, and then I had been going back in 2016 for a series of different things. And of course, I was there a lot for 2017. I feel like it was a moment where we began to understand the power of what public art can do and how it's different from necessarily even exhibitions in an art space, that public art really, the function is to kind of create a dialogue. And in some ways we could see the artwork is just an artifact of that. It was just the beginning, of course, because there was much dialogue that has been created since the inauguration. But that day, I think we felt the energy. We felt the beginnings of that.
Yeah. And also the idea that we actually created this space for Black bodies or Black people to see themselves in a powerful way. I mean, up till then, I don't think people really understood what it meant, at least not in Denmark. They didn't understand it, but then it was there. It was a huge manifestation, and it was received overall pretty well.
Yeah.
And then suddenly, I think, yeah, it was really a big moment in so many ways.
Clearly, its impact on just ordinary people in Denmark, as you saw in the faces and the voices of the people in the Black Lives Matter march, was really powerful. Well, I'm wondering, because there's a whole lot of different levels of knowledge, of awareness of Danish colonial history, and frankly, of just the Black diaspora and that history in our audience coming to this conversation today. Could you take a moment and just explain what makes Queen Mary a queen and the role of queens in this history and the important symbolism of that for Black women in particular, but yeah, Black people throughout the diaspora, throughout the world, and particularly in Denmark and in the U.S. Virgin Islands.
Vaughn, you want to?
Yeah, I'd like to give out a shout out to another collective that I'm a part of called the Virgin Islands Studies Collective, which is a group of 4 different women. And we recently wrote an article last year called Ancestral Queendom, in which we take each one of us takes a prison record of the 4 queens who are known to be the leaders, and kind of pick apart through our different disciplines, because we're all from different disciplines. We have an anthropologist, a philosopher, a writer, and a visual artist. I think in writing that article and in doing this monument with Jeanette, it's gotten me to really think about, of course, as I said, Queen Mary is a heroine in the Virgin Islands, but she's not a queen in the way that we think about in terms of Europe. She's a queen because she was like, I would say, there's a line from my essay, I said, their queens are born, our queens are made. Our queens are forged from, they're usually appointed in the community, but we also have a legacy of all kinds of queens, from carnival queens and pageant queens. And in some ways, this idea of a queen in the Caribbean is an amalgamation of a lot of those concepts. But primarily, Queen Mary was a queen because of her role as being a leader. In the prison record, she's actually the only one that they acknowledge her as being a queen in her prison record. They say she's the one they call the queen. Whereas the others, kind of that label of being a queen came after the fire burn. Queen Mary was a queen even before, because of her leadership role before. And it really means that in this kind of African Caribbean tradition, the strength of feminine power, women who are leaders in the community. But it in this particular context, it really means that we can all aspire. It's not like a separation, an elitism. It's more about we can all aspire to be that kind of queen.
Right. Jeanette, what does that mean to you as someone who's based in Denmark?
Well, I can definitely relate to it. I mean, of course, this narrative is not really common knowledge here due to the lack of knowledge of the African diaspora.
Mhm.
But apart from that, I feel that, I mean, right now also it's super relevant with what is going on all over the world, but also in Denmark. There's been a lot of resistance during this last year, and all these conversations are definitely coming up and running. So it makes a lot of sense to highlight this part of history and this notion of queendom, or within the African diaspora. Definitely, I feel it's so relevant.
Right.
Mhm.
Speaking about the fire burn and that really critical moment in history that, of course, Queen Mary is so well known for, could you talk a little bit about the significance of the fire burn? That this was a time in history, of course, that was several decades post-emancipation of enslaved people in the Danish West Indies, but it was before the United States purchased the islands. So even though people were technically free, there was a huge legacy there of slavery that needed to be addressed. Could you talk a little bit about the significance of the fire burn in that moment, and then what connects that moment, that fire burn, to today, as Jeanette was saying? Why does it resonate to today in particular, for what's going on in the world?
You want to talk about the fire burn?
Yeah, there was, after the United States purchased for the Virgin Islands from Denmark, they sent a commission of doctors, military doctors, to kind of assess the situation. So that would have been in, the early 1900s. And I came upon a document that was really shocking to me because it talked about people's mortality rate. And it was around 54% in St. Croix at one point. And I think if people just think about this in the context of the pandemic, where we're thinking about the mortality rate of people dying now, and we're very alarmed at the percentages, imagine being in a place where people are literally being worked to death at a rate as high as 50%, 50+%. And so that is what people were rebelling against in the fire burn. They were rebelling against conditions in which they were being pretty much worked to death. And so even after the abolition of slavery, the Danish government very quickly, and the Danish planters very quickly enacted a series of laws to kind of keep people in similar conditions. So power just kind of transformed. And that's what people were being very frustrated at, that they still couldn't leave their plantations. They still couldn't have this kind of freedom. They were getting paid, but now they're getting paid and they have to provide food and housing for themselves. So it's almost as if it's worse. So people were very, very frustrated at that. And that's what they were fighting against. And after the fire burn, it kind of begins the beginnings of the labor movement in the Virgin Islands, which then leads to, David Hamilton Jackson and official labor unions starting. And there was a lot of conversations between David Hamilton Jackson. He came to Denmark and spoke a few times and spoke to labor unionists there, I should say, as well. So
he's an important newspaper editor, right, of the Herald.
Yeah, he went to Denmark also to, again, when we're thinking about now in terms of we understand how our press can be compromised, he also understood that if all of the media is only from the Danish colonial government, that as a people couldn't really, you didn't have access to information, and in some ways you didn't have a way to think through yourself. So he started the first newspaper. He petitioned the Danish king to get the first newspaper started, and that, I think, the first edition came out in 1915. And it was a very significant archive because you could see it lasted for several years, and you could really see that it's the beginnings of Virgin Islanders thinking through this, both their coloniality and how to navigate that, and how to navigate themselves and project themselves into the future.
Yeah, and in relation to what it means for today, or I just wanted to say also, first of all, that that this is Denmark's first and biggest, I think, labor revolt, because it was Denmark at that point. So, and we didn't, I mean, it's not part, maybe it is now more or less, but it wasn't part of the curriculum at that point. I mean, until a few years ago. So this is Danish history, of course, and that's so important that we acknowledge that and that we start getting conscious around that. And then your question about what it means for today or in relation to what's going on today. I mean, there's a straight line from what happened at that point and before the fire burn also. I mean, from colonialism, from the birth of colonialism up till today, I mean, it's the same, those are the same issues and questions that are being posed and worked around. But some of it, of course, some of the issues and problems, of course, have transformed, or, you know, but it's the root is the same. All the problems that we are facing today, in my view, derives from colonialism, from the birth of colonialism, from white supremacists, white supremacy, a Eurocentric gaze and a Eurocentric worldview.
I wanted to ask both of you, speaking of that Eurocentric worldview, I wanted to ask both of you about nostalgia, and specifically colonial nostalgia. Vaughn, I know that you have worked with this in your previous work as well, right? But both of you have had to deal, and of course, just living in Denmark, Jeanette, I'm sure that it abounds. The connections of Denmark to the former Danish West Indies, the former colonial period, is often cast as those were the glory days, or right, in a European colonial context. How do you, in your work, each of you as artists, grapple with this colonial nostalgia and create counter narratives? It just seems nostalgia is something that is so based in something more slippery, emotion, ideology, all kinds of. It's very, very difficult, right, to counter sometimes. How do you grapple with that in your work?
I mean, it's something I think about a lot. You mentioned that it's something very much in Denmark. It's very much here too, because overlaid on top of the colonial narrative is the tourism narrative. And so to be able to sell ourselves as, which is our main economic driver, there's a lot of glossing over of our violent colonial past as well. So that's where you can have people wanting to have their wedding ceremony in the middle of a sugar plantation and things like that. I mean, that happens here too. Kind of also the celebration of coloniality in a way, like, you know, where we talk about our 7 flags and the 7 different countries who colonized us in a celebratory way. Which is also, again, reveals our own ways that we're still colonized in our mindset, and how it's difficult to talk about these issues. I think it's difficult on both sides for different reasons, and it looks differently. But for us here, we have a lot of colonial nostalgia. I think for me, I mean, it's something I deal with in my work a lot, and a lot of it is unearthing some of the narratives. I have a recent work that I've been using some of the images that come out of colonial archives, and I've been doing a series called Cuts and Burns into those images, because especially when you're thinking about Black bodies and a lot of these colonial photography, it's a particular worldview that's being constructed, and it's very difficult to penetrate it. It's very difficult to change it, where you have Black bodies being positioned in the landscape in a way to represent the ordered nature of not only the white gaze, but just, you know, the way that they're being almost equated to the animals in some way. And you can see these power structures and the ways that they're being asked to stand in the photographs, who they're standing next to, what they're doing in the photograph. All of those are very constructed. And so when we look back at these archives, like, how do we begin to not only be aware of that gaze, but how do we transform the narrative? So I have a series that I've been working on where I actually burn out some of the landscapes so that the Black bodies kind of can be pushed forward, and you can see them in a different way. Sorry, I think you're hearing my roosters. That's part of our soundscape here. That's perpetual. So sorry about that.
That's awesome.
Yeah, for me, it's like, I mean, yeah, living in Denmark, and I grew up in Denmark. As I mentioned before, it hasn't been really something that we have been dealing with, our colonial history. So my approach in the beginning was really much about erasure of history, erasure of this knowledge. And that has been my journey into it. So in the beginning, I worked a lot with erasure and absence, to talk about the absence of colonial knowledge, but also, of course, the erasure of when you enslave someone, you erase everything. I mean, identity, traditions, culture, and everything. So, and then along the way, I began more to deal with resistance, and my work became more confrontative. So that's where I am right now, I think. Well, I approach this also in very different ways, but it's pretty much dealing with, resistance and counter narratives, and, you know, being more confrontative than my early works. And I find that, I mean, people are receiving it differently, of course. And yeah, I think it's great to do different a variation of expressions, and a variation of ways of dealing with this. But I mean, I certainly feel that, especially my confrontative works, they are very powerful in relation to this nostalgia, because people are really, for instance, the Whip It Good piece really makes people, it awakens people in a way. Some people, of course, also get mad about it, but I think it's a piece that it functions here in Europe, and in where everything has been swept away. It functions as a wake-up call, and it might be different in a Caribbean context. But I also made it in the States a few times. I mean, so, and it also worked there. I mean, it works differently each time and each location. It depends on the audience. It depends on history of the space and everything. So yeah.
Yeah. You mentioned that your work has moved more from erasure and trying to expose that erasure to active resistance. And I'm thinking about your recent work, We Are Magic, We Are Real. You were named an Artist of the Year in Denmark for this. Could you talk a little bit about your current work? And do you feel like working on I Am Queen Mary and collaborating with Vaughn Belle in recent years, has that created more of a space for the work that you're doing now in a place like Denmark, where, like you said, the talk of colonialism has really not been, you know, at the agenda for a long time? Yeah,
I mean, for me, it's been really like my own journey. I mean, because when I first started working around these issues, I was so impacted by the erasure that I and also how little of it I knew myself. I mean, I was just so mad about it. So I was really focusing on the erasure, and literally I was working with erasure also in my images. And then little by little, when I started getting more into the context and to history, and I mean also digging into myself, because of course there's so many things layered within me that I have never really been able to articulate, because when you don't have any role models here, I mean, of Black people, it's difficult to articulate. Even though you know of all these, you have these, you have the experience, but you just don't know how to articulate it. So it was just like a source that kind of opened up, and it was just unstoppable. And it's still, I'm still putting out stuff. Anyway, so it's been, I mean, step by step, it's been escalating in a way, I would say. And then, of course, the I Am Queen Mary project is a huge manifestation of presence, and the collaboration with Vaughn has, of course, made a huge impact on my understanding of the issues that we're dealing with. So yeah, of course, it has impacted my work. But I just see like a straight line from where I came from, and it's just built up. And it's a natural, I think it's a natural development for the work that I've done, and for my own growth.
Yeah, good. Vaughn, would you say that there is more space today for this kind of art of resistance and having conversations about this colonial history than there has been in the past? I mean, both of you are very established artists and have been working on these for a very long time. What is there more of a space, more reception to this today? And why do you think that is, if that is the case?
I mean, I guess it would say the space depending on which context, you know. I mean, although my studio is based in the Virgin Islands, I think of myself obviously as an artist in the world. So I exhibit in different locations, and I think that, yeah, I would say that in general, more and more space is being made for artists who are interested in talking about these issues, and decoloniality, and all of those topics that have grown, and there's been more synergy, and there's more people dealing with them. But I would also say there's a simultaneous push against that in a way, because as an artist of color, sometimes there almost tends to be an expectation that your art has to be about resistance, and it has to be about struggle. And so I think there's also a simultaneous push against that. Like sometimes maybe you want to talk about other issues. But I think it depends on what each artist, how they see the purpose of their practice. And I know for me, it's always been a place for me to gain knowledge about things. It's a place for me to think through difficult issues and when I came back from art school in Cuba, and, you know, had learned these amazing techniques of thinking about how to use art to think through your surroundings, and how to make art that spoke to those issues. The most pressing issue as a Virgin Islander was our coloniality. That was the thing that I could see impacted every aspect of our life. So that's part of the reason why my art continues to push. So it doesn't even so much matter like if there's more space for me to talk about it. It's more like what drives my practice. Yeah.
Yeah, it seems like it's not even necessarily that more space is opening up so much as you're really pushing for this space. I mean, it's fascinating to me that both of you, even after the original project fell apart, you didn't give up. You pressed forward with this, and this was not a commissioned work of art, right?
And that's actually really important. That's really important because, I mean, yeah, we took that space. So and pushed into that space, and yeah, that's an important part of this whole
and hopefully transforming it, because, you know, at the time that we did the project, that warehouse space was closed. Denmark did not seem to want to have too much interest in it being kind of this museum that displayed these cast figures. And so the institution was closed and was slated to be sold, which is quite surprising to think about the historical significance of that building, that this is where the king would look at all the goods coming from the Caribbean colonies, that so much of the wealth of Copenhagen was built based of those products. And to think that the remnant of that would be sold off, you know, to developers was kind of shocking. And I think that both Jeanette and I could take some credit for feeling that putting I Am Queen Mary there helped to raise consciousness, not just about colonial history, but about the significance of that building. And now there's talks to hopefully have that building be a space to talk about colonial history and decoloniality. So, you know, it's really, for me, it's I think one of the greatest probably joys of and accomplishments of my life to see that, to really see, because, you know, people think like art is sometimes just that it doesn't do anything, but because art can change people's minds and it's people who change things, that's how art can change things. You change it through people. And because the project, I feel, it is so much about presence, and it is so much about inviting people to think about their relationship to this history. So when you walk up to the monument and you see the only text that's there is the title and the artist's names, I am Queen Mary, and you have to say that. What does that mean for you to say that? I think that it begins to open up conversations and a dialogue, and through that things can change.
And also I forgot to mention that it's actually astonishing that 98% of sculptures in public space in Copenhagen represent white males. So just to put this humongous Black woman right there, it was really, it was a big thing. And to take that space.
Yeah. And as vulnerable as I Am Queen Mary has been to the elements, you know, she's been damaged by storms several times. Now it had to be taken down, I think, because of the last damage on December 27th. How to what extent does this present an opportunity? I mean, to get the commitment, to gather that commitment, to make this a permanent statue. I saw in your press release after that damage that there has been some commitment from the Danish Parliament to cast this in bronze. Talk a little bit more about those efforts and what partners you're hoping will step forward.
I think in general we have a lot of great support from people. We have so many, and I'm so grateful for that. We have so many people asking us, what can we do to help? How can we, you know, a lot of people really want to have it there and to help us. So we're very fortunate in that sense. And it's a long journey. I mean, there's so many things that needs to be put into place before. It's not only about money. It's so many layers and bureaucracy, and there's so much that needs to be established. So, but we're really working hard on it, and
I'll give you one example of something that may be surprising that people would not necessarily think needs to be thought about, but for this to be permanent and to be accepted by some Danish institution, you know, even thinking about the coral stones, and, you know, how will those be maintained, and how will they be cleaned, and can they handle the Scandinavian weather, and what is going to be the process of in terms of conservation of those materials. So it's from those kinds of details all the way to what kind of structure that Jeanette and I need to create to receive the funds is part of what has made this, you know, and of course it didn't help that we're in the middle of a pandemic and so many things have been shut down and things like that, but we're both very confident with the support that we've and the conversations that have begun that we will be able to make it a permanent monument.
Sounds fantastic. We're going to turn it over to questions in a few minutes, I think, from people who've been sending in questions, but I wondered if you could just talk, both of you, for a minute about what you learned from one another. I mean, did you have much contact with one another's homes in the sense of the islands and Copenhagen prior to this collaboration? So what have you learned from one another, both in terms of personally as artists, from the sharing of the spaces and the experiences? What has that been like for each of you?
We actually knew each other since 2008. So we knew each other for 8 years before we started working on this. But we didn't know each other well, but we knew each other.
I think a really good example of something that I've learned from Jeanette would be my different interpretation of her piece, Whip It Good, is a very good example of what it's like to work with an artist from a different part of the Black diaspora. You know, I grew up in the Virgin Islands. I lived in the United States for about 10 years when I went to study at Columbia University in New York. And I've lived in Cuba, but primarily I'd never lived in Europe nor spent a lot of time. And, but in 2017, I was there for almost 6 months on and off, and then 3 months straight. And a lot of that time was working on this project. And I think when I first saw Jeanette's Whip a Good piece, it was challenging for me to understand because I come from a place where just a few steps away, there was a whipping post. And this idea of like a Black female character whipping against a white canvas seemed just a strange, it almost seemed like a revenge fantasy narrative until I spent more time in Denmark and really very profoundly saw the kind of violence of it, what erasure and how violent that was on your body, being a Black person moving around in Denmark. My children were with me at that time. They felt it too. That was their first experience in racism. And it made me understand why Jeanette would develop a piece like that. Because in some ways she was matching the violence that was on her body that she'd lived with that action. So it wasn't really about revenge. It was about how do you match a force with a force. So it was more, I understood the piece differently, especially when I spent more time there. And of course, you know, in many conversations with Jeanette, but there were things that I definitely, and also like when she talked a lot about how important it was to have Black representation. And I had lived in an all white space. I lived in Wisconsin when I was 6 years old. So I kind of had a little glimpse of that, but I lived there for a year. But it is very different if you're Black European and growing up in a space where people constantly even quite, like I would be with Jeanette and they would ask me, they would of course say like, where are you from? But they would then ask her where she's from. And she'd be like, I'm Danish. And it was like, so to kind of be in a place where you're constantly being rejected, like people don't see you at, you know, that was very informative for me and kind of understanding our different perspectives.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And of course, I mean, I got not the opposite, but working with Vaughn has really given me a new connection to the Caribbean and to a Caribbean gaze, which of course I've been in the Caribbean a lot. I've been in Trinidad where my father's from, but Vaughn has really taught me to flip my mind in a new way and to flip my gaze. So yeah, that was a really good, that was very needed for this project. And it completely gave it new dimensions when we started working together. It was really, yeah, it was a match made in heaven in a way,
Mm-hmm.
I would say.
I think it was transformative. You know, I think a lot of people also probably don't I mean, I thank you for that question because a lot of people probably don't, they see us as two Black female artists and it's, you know, they don't necessarily understand that, yeah, we have a lot of similarities, but there's a lot of differences. There's a lot of challenges that come from, you know, what does it mean to be an artist from the former colonized place and the colonized place, and how do we see each other differently, and how do we understand each other's stories and positions and access to power and narrative and, you know, a lot of things.
Well, this has just been a fabulous discussion, and we really appreciate both the wonderful questions and the fascinating answers. It's time to give our audience a moment to ask more questions. We have one message from Troy, who's also an ASF fellow. He thanks you for a wonderful presentation and for your work. He's wondering if any thought has been given to having a version of the sculpture in the US Virgin Islands. Right now, he says the two sculptures can only be found in the two metropolitan colonial centers.
Yes, that is something, it is a hurt. That was a really big pain for, I think, a lot of Virgin Islanders to see our national heroine in Denmark. And we don't have a similar sculpture here. And part of that, you know, of course, is the funding. Some of that is the funding. Some of it is the way that the project was designed, that, you know, Jeanette was able to raise funds and then, you know, invited me to collaborate with her. And that was part of the reason why the project centered in Denmark. And there's always been that question of what would it look like to, you know, because they were supposed to, project start off with 2 monuments and 2 ideas of having 2 monuments. So we are still in conversations. It is very, very difficult because, you know, we live in a place that has a lot of lack, and to put that kind of money towards an artwork is challenging in a place where our hospital is still in modular since the hurricane, and our schools need so much work, and we just have a lot of institutional lack here. So it's challenging. But we are in talks and we're still pushing forward, but that's, I would say, primarily the challenge. And so we're hoping that when it's taken so much energy just to get this one permanent in Denmark, that our focus has been primarily on that. And then hopefully we'll be able to focus on getting one in the Virgin Islands. But we did have a series of talks on each one of the main islands to talk about the project, and also to assess the willingness to bring it here. Because remember, the impulse in Denmark was really about pushing against Danish colonial amnesia, whereas in the Virgin Islands, we don't have that same need to push and take up space, that it actually needs to be a kind of a different process. And so part of us was trying to assess that. And I think, one of the most touching, when we would have people say to us, our children deserve that image too. So there's a desire to have that the monument here as well. And so we're hoping that will happen.
Yeah, each island wanted one.
Mm-hmm.
But maybe we can only do one.
Yeah.
Yeah. We actually also thought at some point of having a fourth sculpture in Ghana, in the former Danish territory.
Mm-hmm.
But that's something like way out in the future, if ever. But that would also celebrate the 4 queens if we had 4. Mm-hmm.
We have another question. While there have been a few new academic research projects in Denmark geared towards examining Denmark's colonial past, you oftentimes hear this sort of conversation about colonial history dismissed as, quote, American identity politics. How do you combat against this narrative, and what can Danish museums and institutions do to help make society more open to critical reflections on racism in Denmark, past and present?
Let me see, I'm not sure if I understood the full question. I'm gonna go look at it again. It was very long. Complex.
I don't know if I understand, but I can start talking about, I think
I'm going to try to interpret, but I think it's just dismissing colonial history as sort of identity.
Yeah.
How do you combat that sort of dismissive attitude?
I think it's about education again. It's about knowledge, and one of the ways in which you can produce knowledge and make awareness of this is creating an art project like Queen Mary, because it speaks directly to our history. But there's a lot of other great efforts in Denmark going on right now, where people, all sorts of people, academics and activists, and people are really trying to open up for conversation around these issues. And it's really, it's great times right now. In that sense, not that we're still just scratching the surface, but I normally say that I have high hopes for the youth, because they are pretty open and flexible, and they don't want to deal with these old colonial structures. In fact, they want to create something new, and they have such a huge knowledge already. When I'm thinking about myself, and like when I was in my early 20s or whatever, so in that sense, I feel that something is going on. I feel it's on a global scale. Of course, we have seen a lot of things during the last year, and right now is really in the States also really like out in the open. It's been there all the time, but what we see now is so I think it's still really relevant to have the majority of Danes understand how we are connected to the American history as well. To this whole global history. It's a European history. It derives from Europe. And to have that connection, to have people not de-link from that, because a lot of people still don't understand why this history is relevant and why we need to deal with these issues. They only see it as like a isolated thing. So that is the big problem here, that people need to see this as an ongoing story that started 500 years ago.
I find, as a Virgin Islander, the question is a little bit ironic because it's almost using, it's kind of pushing against this narrative that Danes perhaps use American identity politics as a way to cloak dealing with their own colonial history and identity. And around the centennial, that was the inverse conversation here, where a centennial technically should have thought and more about our relationship to the United States, because it was, the centennial was the 100 years that we were a part of the United States. But instead, the centennial focused on our past relationship to Denmark. And that, in a way, was us using our history as a way to cloak and not talk about our current colonial status and opening up those conversations. So I find that that's kind of a really, it's interesting, that inverse relationship. I think in general, these conversations are difficult to have, but that's also how you know that they have a lot of power. When people don't want to talk about them, that's when you know that they have a lot of power.
Well, thank you both very much for your thoughtful comments and for your fabulous work. It's really an honor to have you here. And thank you, Ursula, for your great questions and shaping the discussion today. It's great. And I hope that those of you who have attended will also watch the We Carry It With Us film and join us again next week for our next discussion in this series.
Sally, I'm sorry, could I just ask one quick question? For our artists, there are a lot of people wondering how they can, who they would contact if they wanted to assist with the fundraising toward the bronze statue. I just want to make sure that gets out there.
Yeah, thank you for asking that question. So on our website, we do have an email list that we're collecting, so that when we do launch our fundraising component, that people can be a part of that. So if you can please just go onto our website, I Am Queen Mary, and sign up for our email list, and that's how you'll know when we begin to launch that part.
Great. And we have also lots of comments that are thanking you and us for this discussion. There is one comment that says Queen Mary is live and well at Barnard.
Yeah, that's Monica.
We'll look forward to going to see it once we can. So it's really been an honor and a pleasure to have you here with us.
Yeah. Thank you everyone for all the questions and for listening. Thank you so much.
Okay. And just one final reminder that that Scandinavia House and the American Scandinavian Foundation are presenting the Nordic and Baltic Oscar contenders now. And so please go to scandinaviahouse.org for more information and tune in to some of these fabulous films. So thank you all very, very much. And we look forward to following your work in the future and seeing Queen Mary multiply.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Thank you so much. Yeah. Thanks.
Okay. Bye, everyone.
Take care.
Bye-bye.
Bye.